You're listening to Body Banter, a podcast where we have conversations about the human body in all its forms and from as many perspectives we can find.
We are your hosts, Shagun Yedele
and Claudia Krebs.
And we are professors of anatomy in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada.
Anatomy is for everybody and every body, and we're here to get the body banter going.
We hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Body Banter. My name is Shagun Yedele, and I am speaking today from Kelowna, which is in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Syilx Okanagan Nations here in Canada. And with me, as usual today, my co-host, Claudia. Hi, Claudia.
Yeah, hi. Hi, everyone. I am joining you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam Nation, or the beautiful UBC campus in Vancouver, Canada. Welcome to today's podcast. We have a fabulous guest with us today. I am so happy to have Martine Dunnwald here on the podcast with us. She is the immediate past president of the American Association for Anatomy, a good friend and an educator and a researcher and an artist. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's such an honor.
The honor is ours. You have been in anatomy in this field for a number of years, but that's not where you started. Can you tell us a little bit about your pathway into anatomy, all the way to being the president of the association?
Yeah, well, my path, I have to go back all the way to actually the old continent and to France, because this is really where I grew up. And this is where I started my career. Growing up in an environment where my dad was a physician, I always said I didn't want to do medicine, but somehow I had an attraction for the biology. I thought it was, really interesting. And for a reason that people keep asking me that are still unknown to me, although every day I feel like I may get a better answer for myself, I got attracted to the skin. And I thought that working on the skin was interesting, fascinating, and the path to get to this was going to be to become a pharmacist and do cosmetics. And so that's what I decided to do. And what happened was that I found myself an internship in a cosmetic company and worked in the summer. And after a couple of weeks, realized that working on optimizing the color of lipstick for the rest of my life was going to be the most boring thing ever. But what was fascinating was to try to understand the why. And so it became very clear that research and understanding why a cream would work or why such a disease would be caused by something was where I wanted to be. And so fast forward, I got my PharmD degree, and after an internship in Quebec in a small research lab, I went back to do my PhD. And so I often say I'm a cell biologist, but more often I say I'm a skin biologist because I never really deviated from this interest. So I did a PhD in cell and molecular biology, really working on skin development, hair follicle stem cells, tissue-engineered skins. Did a postdoc in skin disease nearby where you guys are, because that was in Seattle at the University of Washington. And then landed at the University of Iowa in this kind of a upper postdoc position, and then had a few positions in different departments, but always doing research on skin. And it's when I was at the University of Iowa that eventually I became familiar with the AAA.
That's so interesting. I mean, the skin being our biggest organ and covering our bodies, that was sort of the first step towards becoming an anatomist, I guess, right? So tell us more about how you then came to define yourself as an anatomist.
Yeah, so I still have a hard time to define myself as an anatomist as we speak, but it was really the American Association of Anatomy had its annual meeting with other societies under the umbrella of experimental biology. And one of the person that I was closely working with was Gina Shadowman. Gina Shadowman was a member of AAA, was also involved in different committees. So she invited me as a junior faculty to give a 30-minute talk in one of the symposium. And I was working on epidermal stem cell and their role in cell-based therapy. And I was super excited because when you're a junior faculty, you're like, wow, I got invited. This is exciting. I'm going to present, my budding research. And the experience was great. I loved the people, I loved the interaction. And I actually got an award for it. And so that was also exciting. And I came back the following year, and what happened was a combination of two things. One was her and another colleague of mine, Rebecca Holiday, was saying, AAA, if you have an idea, just submit it as a proposal. Most likely they'll take it. And I had never really heard that from another professional organization. I always thought that these were all behind the scene little things that were happening because you knew a person who knew somebody else. And then the other thing was that Gina was going to leave the program committee where she was at, and she suggested that I replace her. And so those two things in combination made me just continue to come to the AAA. So never really from the anatomy perspective, but always from the basic science perspective. And the anatomy never really even kind of came to mind. It was like this group of people on the side at the meeting that were educators and talking about anatomy teaching. And I always ignore them, sorry. But that was the reality until eventually, about 8 years ago, it became my reality too.
That's such a wonderful story. It's kind of like a metaphor for how, like from where you start, like how the simple subatomic and then the molecular structures and then the tissues build up one next to the other, so that how, your entry into anatomy was like from that level of just your interest in the skin and cell biology of the skin, and then your relationship with somebody else who was on the program committee and saw the value of what you did, and then pulled you in and invited you to make a submission. And so maybe going back to your interest in the skin, tell us a little bit more about that. How long have you been researching the skin? I see that from your bio that you also work on craniofacial biology. And is there like a natural intersection of those two, or what links those two, and how has your journey been in that field?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. If I start with the end of your question, because of the anatomy, if you actually really think about, the skin doesn't stop at the level of your lips, right? I mean, we define the skin by stopping at the level of the lips, but it's not like the covering of the body stops there, right? It continues inside your mouth. So if I'm speaking to the anatomy crowd, everybody will know that there's an epithelium and there is, some connective tissue that is inside our oral cavity. That is the natural continuation of, the epidermis and the dermis on the surface of the body. So from a standpoint of the biology, these epithelial cells, because I have to preface, although I'm a skin biologist, the epidermis is my thing and the keratinocyte is my favorite cell. So I'm going to be very keratinocyte focused. but the keratinocytes into your oral cavity are very similar than the keratinocytes on the outside of your body. And although there are some slight differences, there is this overall arcing of the proteins that make them, right? It's full of keratins. They're called oral keratinocytes or epidermal keratinocytes. Their differentiation program, the formation of a barrier, all of those things are very similar. And what happened was really, from a research perspective, I was at a point in my career where things were not doing great funding-wise. And somebody came in my office and showed me this mouse model that was deficient for a transcription factor. And these people had created intentionally this mouse because they were interested in its role in craniofacial development. But what happened is that when their first knockout mouse was born, these mice had a huge skin defect that they didn't know what to do with it. They didn't know the skin biology. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, I can design 50 experiments right from the get-go. Can I help? I would love to help. So it really became this interesting approach that I think has served the community well, to bring more cell biology to the craniofacial world. That was, I think, maybe more or looking at the genetics of it, or looking at the development, so more embryological processes. But thinking about the cell biology within the oral cavity had not been explored maybe to the extent of what we know now. And so I look at this also from a developmental perspective, because we were interested in wound healing. And so there are processes during embryonic development that get reactivated when we want to heal. And so it was this other way of looking at things from an embryological perspective to a tissue repair. So all of these, in my mind, is always the same coin, and it just has two faces. And then we're just studying both faces at the same time. So
I love that. And it really shows the power of collaboration in the field. And, reaching out across the divide and having embryologists and cell biologists tackling similar questions and or a similar problem with different questions. And I think that's really powerful. Shagan, you wanted to follow up too.
Yeah, just to make that same point, that it shows how collaboration in science, in science, in anatomy, in education, collaboration is like, it's not just a buzzword. It's actually, it's like a living thing. You collaborate or you die. We really need each other. And so I'm just, very interested in how you then continue. Just selfishly, by the way, that skin defect, did you find, just for me, that skin defect that those mice models had, did you find a link? What was the link with orofacial biology? Was it the same molecule that was defective, or what did you find?
Yeah. So thanks for that scientific question. So the transcription factor is called interferon regulatory factor 6. And mutations in that transcription factor, if you're lacking the transcription factor, we actually don't think that any human can survive. So patients that have the mutation are always heterozygote. They always have a good copy. But we think that it really alters the program of the keratinocytes and their ability to differentiate, and to differentiate early on, but also to fully form an epidermis. And one of the function of the skin, it's a barrier function, right? And if we don't have that barrier, then we become vulnerable. And in the absence of IF6, the keratinocyte can do about half of their program of differentiation, and they're missing the other half. And the other half is the really critical point for the full barrier function. So this is, as to the why and how does IF6 does this? Yeah, I think that's going to be years of research, because every day it seems that it does something we didn't know.
Fascinating. That's just... I mean, as you can see, we can geek out for another 30 minutes, but we need to move on to like there are other aspects of your career now. So that journey in science, in cell biology, took you into the anatomy, and it's going to go American Association for Anatomy. So how did your journey progress there? And I'm from this question, I'm trying to like maybe broaden it out to kind of like make a pitch in a way to see that like there's a home for more people, for most people, for what they do in anatomy in the association, you know. So just using yourself as an example, how did your career then bring you to the point where you became very prominent in the association?
So there's multiple facets to your question. So thank you for asking. I'm going to try to remember to, answer most of those. So there's one aspect which is, to the association. The other aspect is how did I really get to study maybe or to teach the anatomy or the human body? So from the association perspective, I had been on the program committee for many years, and I was elected as the program committee chair. That was a position that up until a few years ago gave us, was a little bit unique compared to the other committee chair. So we were present at the board, we were part of the executive committee, and so I became familiar with the leadership of the organization just by being on the program committee. But the other thing is the annual meeting is almost like this kind of centerpiece of the organization, right? It's when everybody gets together, it's when we see everyone, when everything is buzzing and bubbling, and which is a lot of fun. And so I think it was also being, seeing all the interaction, how we plan a meeting, how we make, hopefully everybody happy with, scheduling things that are interesting for the organization. So being aware of what are the topics that people want to talk about, what are the abstracts that are submitted. So I felt that I got a really good appreciation of the organization by really being on the program committee. How did I become president? Somebody asked me if I would consider putting my name on the ballot, and I was honored. And I'm like, oh my God, are you really thinking about me? And they say yes. And I'm like, okay. And I guess people voted, and this is how it happened. So that was kind of from the anatomy perspective. How did I become more familiar with?
Just before you move on to the second point, I really want to talk a little bit more about this, like how anatomy is really this big tent, right? Like there's so many things that fall under the umbrella of anatomy. And I think you really show that well in your own career and then in what you've done for the association in terms of programming and then your leadership in bringing a diversity of people into this big tent. And when I think of the annual meeting, it always feels like this massive family reunion. Again, the idea of a big tent where everybody comes together to talk and to celebrate. It seems like a good metaphorical way of looking at it. When you consider this big tent, who are we missing?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think that I don't know if we're really missing people, but I think there are people who don't see themselves under the tent. And I wish they would. And the part that I think I wish people would see them as being covered and being part of the, camping trip would be people that are as primary interest are cell biologists or even molecular biologists, if you want. And I think the appreciation that it all starts with anatomical sciences. And I think we have lost that perspective because we think that now we need to be specialized, right? We just need to talk about single cell RNA sequencing. And it's like, okay, it's just a technique. What is it going to tell you, right? And going back to these very basic 4 disciplines, the gross anatomy, the microanatomy or histology, the embryology, and the neuroanatomy, you cover it all. But it seems that it's not cool to talk about this, right? We want to talk about we're doing these fancy, profile, proteomics, and this is cool. But if you don't know the structure of an organ, if you don't know how the cell is working, if you don't know how you put two cells together and how they attach to each other to form a tissue, where are you going to go? If you say that you're going to solve cystic fibrosis and you don't know the structure of the lung, I don't think you're going to make much progress. If I don't understand how keratinocytes are organized and stratified to form the barrier, how can I pretend that eventually I'm going to solve a problem related to psoriasis? So I think that I wish that every graduate student who goes into cell and developmental biology would have this, let's go back and let's look at the fundamental of our body and understand, or the embryology for some of them, or some of them the overall organization, and reflect on what can we appreciate from that. And then actually realize that, oh my God, but if I know all of these structures, maybe I can interpret this coronal section that I see on histology, where really my only focus was one structure, but now I have 15 other ones that I can interpret because I'm knowledgeable about it. And maybe I can find 10 other things that are wrong in this section that I would never have been able to identify or find. And I think that's definitely a big miss from the new generation, thinking that they just have to go with this new fancy thing, when I think the body has so much to offer to scientists.
Yeah, it goes back to an adage that I carry with me from one of my old anatomy teachers. You only see what you know. And so the more you know, the more you can ask questions, and the more you know who to reach out to for your collaborations.
I'll remember that one.
That's such a great quote, Claudia. You only see what you know, which brings us back, Martine, to what you were saying earlier about, I so love your enthusiasm and your appreciation for the basic sciences, and I hope some of our students will be listening to this podcast so that they can actually see somebody collaborate or corroborate rather what we always tell them, how no matter the subspecialty or the area you go into, you still need that basic grounding in anatomy. And so our question to you then, Martine, is, so how did you become a teacher of anatomy?
Yeah, so, in life, often a negative event outcome becomes a positive. And so this is really how it happened. I found myself against the wall for securing research funding. And it was, okay, well, if I don't get money in a year and a half, I'll put the key under the door. But that doesn't mean that I cannot contribute to something in something, right? And so it was like, what is the field and what can I contribute? Or what is it that I like that I could potentially make maybe a second career of, or a continuation in a different way? And although it was challenging moments because you really do a soul searching, it was very clear in my mind that I always liked to teach. And although I hadn't really formally teach in undergraduate level or in professional in front of, I had done occasional dental student histology teaching, but it was not part of my routine. But in the lab, I just love to see students coming in, not knowing very much. And then depending on their level, they grow, they see, they learn, you see in their eyes, something clicks. And so that sharing of the information and providing more knowledge to that person, for that person then to grow into, or bloom like a flower, was very rewarding. And so in that perspective, I came to Darren Hoffman's office, another AAA member, dear friend and colleague, and presented him with my challenge. It's like, okay, well, I like to teach, is there any teaching opportunity? So he said, yeah, you can teach, for dental histology. And I was like, well, this is 12 lectures a year. This is not really a job. And then he's like, well, but maybe, are you interested in gross anatomy? And I'm like, are you looking at the wall behind me or are you talking to me? He said, no, I'm talking to you. And I say, Darren, I never, ever, ever, ever had anatomy. Not in high school, not in pharmacy, not as a PhD. And he said, are you interested? And I said, well, the first thing you're going to need to double check is that I'm not going to faint when I'm going to enter the growth lab. But if I pass that test, I'm willing to try. And so that was the start of an 18-month journey where I went back to taking classes with professional students, passed the exam, did the pen test. And what really confirmed my knowledge was the anatomy training program that is sponsored by AAA, organized by the British Society of Anatomy, for which I was enrolled and did the program over 2 years. Yeah, the university and the Department of Anatomy offered me a job to teach because I thought I was not going to get any grants. And then after 2 months into the job, I got the grant. And I'm like, now what? And I decided to continue to do both. And as of today, I love it.
That's a wonderful story again of resilience and of taking chances and of willingness to learn, just some of those same qualities that we always kind of talk about on the podcast. And I'm happy to see that you are an embodiment of those values. And so we've talked about your journey into anatomy and into the Anatomy Association. And I know that Claudia wanted to talk about this, but maybe I should start. And that's exactly what, about your interest in art, your interest in how art intersects perhaps with the human body, and your interest in music, because I read from your bio as well that you play the piano, so how does all of this integrate for you, your interest in art, your love of science, teaching? How does everything come together for Martine and make a whole?
Well, it's going to be hard. It's a great question. And, I'm going to try to be brief. I think it starts growing up. And it starts with the values of your family and your parents. And my parents always taught me we were always well-rounded. And when I say well-rounded, there was always a component of music. It was so one instrument, sometimes two, but one instrument, one sports, school, just a balance growing up. And music was always part of growing up. So yes, I started the piano. I knew the record because then I could take it with me, because when we would go on vacation, we had to, have instruments that could be carried and play when we were in vacation. We would play for the family. I played four hands with my dad. So music was always, it was playing and it was listening. It's the same thing. It's like you wanted to touch a little bit on everything, because there is multiple aspects, in our life. There's the arts, and then the sports, and then there's the science. So I think that's where it came from. The other part of the art, which is maybe more, I think I've been interested in visual. And I think it intersects with the skin. Very much so, because the skin being kind of the outside of our body. We can discuss this ad nauseum about what our skin is telling us about the inside of the body, but it's the outside. So it's the outside face. I think in high school, I was interested in trying to copy little ads, in magazines as an art of drawing faces. And so that visual carried on. My dad loved to take pictures. So I got my camera and I kind of continue to kind of look at things with this visual attraction. And if you would ask me today, I don't think I could do science that is not visual. I like to look at cells. I like to look at things, or on the confocal or under a microscope. I like to look at cells moving. If you give me a test tube and there's a little pellet at the bottom, it's not really interesting. I'll do it for the sake of the science. But so I think that visual has carried all along. For some of those who know me, I like to, color match maybe my clothes, or I like to, there's always this visual attraction and I look at people. I like to look at who they are, how they express themselves. So I'm very always drawn to the visual. And so there's so much, the anatomy and the art and the visual. I mean, what else do you want? It's right there for you, right?
It does seem like a complete continuation of everything. We see this a lot, that folks who are attracted to anatomy are attracted to the visual aspect of it, and are by and large visual people, in that they appreciate other visual things in life, whether it's looking at cells under a microscope or looking at art. The other aspect that you talked about in your research was that big part of collaboration, and the foundation of collaboration is listening. And I guess you learned that playing four hands with your dad, because you can't really do chamber music without listening to the other person and having an almost intuitive way of collaborating. So I think all of that must have carried forward into who you are today. So I guess it's a big shout out for an arts education for all of us, because it helps us live in this world and be in this world in a meaningful way. And it gives us those skills of collaboration and listening. So thank you for emphasizing that.
Well, thank you for giving me that opportunity to share those thoughts.
So Martine, when you went into your anatomy course with the British Association, and you really made the commitment to become an anatomy educator, and you did all the dissections and all the learning and all the tests, did you come across an area of the body that you would say, no, that is now my favorite body part?
So this is an interesting and hard question for me to answer, because I can't get away from the skin.
And you
the skin is the first thing that you throw in the bucket when you really want to study the anatomy, right? So it's always been somewhat ironic, because you don't really need to know much anatomy or gross anatomy for studying the skin. But I will not budge from the skin and say that it is my favorite body part.
That's fair. And, I think we need to emphasize the skin a little bit more. When we take the students into their first lab, of course, they touch the skin of their donor and they make that first cut, which is, a big deal. And then 10 minutes later, they're just busy taking the skin away without thinking much more about it, and that carries forward. So to have an emphasis on the skin and a true appreciation of it, I think that's important. That's great.
Yeah, I always joke with them. I always tell them, you just threw out my favorite organ.
Oh, I totally share that sentiment, and I'm going to keep that in mind for the next class of students that arrive, to just spend one more extra minute thinking about that skin that you're about to discard, and that's a good thing. So, having seen what your favorite body part is, Martine, what is your least favorite body part?
Probably things in the GI system. Not really my cup of tea. Obviously, you learn how to dissect it, but I don't really care for. I know these organs are important, but they are not really exciting for me, just as a piece of the body that I can fall in love with, like I fall in love with skin.
That's fair. Any part of the GI tract that's particularly low on the list?
Probably the pancreas, just because it's always so challenging to find and to isolate, and these vasculature that goes in and goes out. And so probably that one.
Yeah, we all agree the pancreas is a bit of a mess.
Totally fine.
Right there on the posterior abdominal wall, and if it doesn't work, you get like all sorts of problems, from diabetes to other digestive problems. And we all know that pancreatic cancer is a huge challenge. Yeah. So yes, I actually kind of agree. The pancreas, I mean, if it's just doing its thing and not becoming noticeable, I guess we can tolerate it. But other than that.
But it makes me appreciate how challenging it is if you do have a problem with the pancreas, and how, people affected by a problem with the pancreas can be challenging, because it is not easy to locate and really to work with. So that's another positive from the anatomy, is I think better appreciation of the intricacy of the bodies that we don't really appreciate if we don't get a chance to look in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's a silver lining that even though it's the least favorite part that you identify with, but it is absolutely vital for our existence. And so we should also appreciate it.
We should all get stickers that say we actually do love our pancreas.
Absolutely.
So that pancreas doesn't get upset with us.
Yes.
But we do need skin too.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, well, Martine, this has been excellent, wonderful talking to you today. And we just want to appreciate you spending time with us today on the podcast. And hopefully, maybe not sometime not too long in the future, we'll have you again, because there's so much we haven't been able to get to talk about today, but maybe some other time. Don't you think so, Claudia?
Absolutely. I feel like that with almost all of our guests, that we could probably talk for 2 to 3 hours. So thank you so much, Martine, for sharing your life and your career and your insights into anatomy. I think your approach to anatomy is definitely more than skin deep, and the way that you integrate the arts and the science and the whole of being Martine into being an educator and a researcher is really inspirational. Thank you so much.
Thank you to both of you. Very much appreciated.
And so, everyone, this brings us to another conclusion of Body Banter. See you next time. Bye. Thank you for listening to another episode of Body Banter.
We are Claudia
and Shegun,
and we look forward to having you join us for more conversations about the human body next time.